of Punjab Knox Studio once again. Your host, Sonia Bird today. And today again we have our wonderful Michelle Robinson, and she is Satudene. And in our previous episode, we got to know a little bit about Indigenous, First Nations, and a little bit. And today we will continue this series, this episode again, and we'll get to know a little bit more.
Sure, maybe some terminology and language.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We're going to the next level.
That's right.
So, Michelle, thank you so much again. Welcome to our show. And the first question I have in my mind is the historical context.
Mm-hmm.
When did your people come into Canada, or even North America, as we call it today, or the Turtle Island, as it was known?
You're learning.
Yes, absolutely, I'm learning. I'm learning with you. So, are there any historical evidences supporting that when this migration took place?
Sure. So there is a propaganda to believe that we somehow migrated here when the truth is we never did.
Huh.
We have always been here, and we have creation stories.
Been here since thousand years ago?
Thousands of years. We call it since the beginning of time. We've always been here. And each nation has what we call creation stories about how we all came to be here.
Nice.
Yeah, so we have been here for thousands of years. I think what happens a lot is that people want to believe we migrated here so that they feel like it was okay they migrated here. But the truth is that there's a huge historical conversation to have here. So we have lived here for thousands and thousands of years. This is actually quite funny to us that folks with the Bible came here to tell us about the land of Eden, but we live in the land of Eden. And then when the Bible came here and the people came here with their Bible, they actually ruined Eden. So it's actually quite ironic. And of course, we have humor in everything we do. We always see the humor in everything that happens to us.
I can imagine that.
Yeah, I can tell you a story. Tell you many stories about humor and how it helps release some of the irony that is so painfully obvious to some people, but not to others. So when you hear us giggling and laughing, we're usually making fun of a situation in the best way that we possibly can. So the Bible came here, and the folks who believe in the Bible came here, and they imposed all of these Christian laws here, British laws, French laws. Those were all brought here under the guise of the Bible. And so that's actually more of the so-called history of immigration. It would actually be all of these other newcomers coming here. And the irony is they actually were very discriminatory about who they would allow here. So, yes. They had brought their laws that were discriminatory to the Chinese and to other people as well.
Chinese, German, Indians, you name it.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
In fact, we even turned away Jewish boats that were seeking refuge from the Holocaust.
Yep. And
because we turned them away, and when I say we, not Indigenous people.
Thank you for clarifying that. I was coming to that, like we.
So,
perfect.
Yeah, the terminology is really interesting. Earlier we had talked about our Indigenous people. But the irony is that is really hurtful to us. In a lot of ways, we talk about community. So we'll say our community of Calgary, and we mean that in a loving, respectful way. But when it comes to our Indigenous people, there's too much hurt there. And because of the Canadian laws, we are considered the ward of the state. And we are not sovereign people under Canadian law. Now, we know better, and we don't acknowledge that. Obviously, we are very proud people, and regardless of their laws, doesn't make us lesser than. However, for Canadians to use that terminology shows that they don't understand the oppression and the power dynamics that have happened with their laws that they've imposed. So we don't like that term, our Indigenous people. Indigenous, so we were talking earlier, you were saying the term Red Indian. and we've talked about Indian, and we've talked about Eskimo, Inuit. So I'm going to kind of break down some of that terminology. I'm going to ask your viewers to not use the term Eskimo or Indian anymore. Redskin, those types of terminologies are hurtful to us. So for example, you'll hear football clubs now say the Edmonton Football Club or the Washington Football Club, because those are very derogatory slurs that were imposed on us.
Yeah, with that, it's all over the news, and it is going on that the Edmonton Eskimos are changing their name.
Yeah, we don't use that term. So I would recommend that you don't use that term, just like I would never say the N-word when referring to Africans, right? So these are terminologies we're going to try to learn to not say anymore. So when you meet an Indigenous person and they introduce themselves, listen to how they introduce themselves. So I have a elder, and she always introduces herself as from Siksika Nation. So I wouldn't call her Indigenous, I wouldn't call her First People, I would say she's from Siksika.
Okay.
Yeah, because she identified herself as that. So a lot of what you hear from Indigenous people will be self-identification. And she'll also say, because she's an older generation, that she's an Indian. But as a newer generation, I would not use that term. There was many awful things that the government has done and continues to do to us today. And Indian is associated with that slur. And she is proud to be who she is. So of course I will never take that away from her. But I would never be a proud Indian. I'm a proud Satu Dene. So that's why we don't use that terminology. So it is really important that we learn it. So First Peoples is an acceptable one, First Nation, when talking about Indigenous people. But Indigenous itself is an umbrella term. It's an umbrella term for First Nation, Métis, and Inuit.
Okay, so it's a perfect. It's an umbrella term.
It's an umbrella term.
I like that.
And that was actually, it came out of a United Nations conversation. There were Indigenous from all around the world who came together and said, what the British have done to us is wrong. How do we, talk about our rights as Indigenous people? And it took a lot for people to say and agree on the term Indigenous. And there are some places that wouldn't be. So if I was in Africa, I would try to find out what the terminology is for the territory that I'm on. No matter where I am in the world, that's what I try to learn. And I think that that's kind of critical to understanding land acknowledgement as well. Yeah, so that's, I hope there's more understanding that First Nations are very distinct. There's over 634 nations just in Canada alone, more if you include the states. The Métis are their own type of people, with their own culture, their own language, and then the Inuit are their own people. Okay. And even in the Inuit, there are many different parts of the Inuit. So that's why these umbrella terms, it's really hard to encapsulate all of that. We don't like to be what we call pan-indigenized, where there's an assumption that my traditions would be the same as the Blackfoot traditions, which would be the same as the Inuit tradition, because none of them are the same. They're all distinct cultures with different dialects, different language, all of them. There's a Northern Slavey, Southern Slavey language, and a lot of people don't like the term Slavey. That was imposed, so we use Satu Dene, and so Northern Satu Dene, South Satu Dene.
Nice.
Many different dialects of Dene, even within that conversation. So there's a huge conversation to have about language, and my hope is that people will listen to the Indigenous person and identify them in that way. Oh, there's Michelle. She's Satu Dene. What does that mean? That's an Indigenous nation for Canada. Oh, there's my friend over there. She is from Siksika Nation. So that's how we identify her. She's part of the Indigenous of Canada. That bigger picture, that conversation. And, we still don't, all of us, we don't speak for each other. So when I speak for me. And I just try to give clarification as people ask questions, which is why I'm so honored to be here today.
Interesting. Well, thank you so much.
You're welcome, Sonia.
So my next question is, how early were people living here, and how did they survive
So we've been here for thousands and thousands of years. We have creation stories. And, we've always worked together as a community, number one. These new ways that were brought with the Bible, they are very individualistic. And capitalism has really brought this individualistic idea to this land. And that's been really hurtful, I think, to all the community, not just the Indigenous community, but everybody. So in our ways, we obviously work together as a community. Every single person had a role in the community. This person, their role might be, teepee poles. All the women all were in charge of the teepees. So just like a woman is a head of the household, they were in charge, and they were also in charge of governance.
Oh.
Yeah, it was the British who came here and ignored the women. That was the start of our relationship.
Oh.
And the Indian Act, even their colonial laws, all were men-based. So, which is insulting to all women, not just Indigenous women, but all women. But it was also insulting that our governance was just disregarded. So we have had our own governance system. We have our ceremonies that are integrated within that governance as well.
That's where I heard a little bit, I know a little bit about chiefs and leaders of your different nations and different, I would say, communities. How does that work?
Yeah, so Canada forced the Indian Act on us, and what they had were Indian agents. And an Indian agent was the person that was from Britain that would tell us what they would allow us to do. So they invented the Northwest Mounted Police, or the RCMP, in order to contain us.
Oh.
There are books and books on clearing the plains. So when we earlier talked about being here for thousands of years and we have the land of Eden, we had so much food and so many resources to be able to live. And we would rotate our crops. So we had different ceremonies that we would do throughout the season and through the 13 moons. Our calendar was 13 moons instead of the 12 that the British imposed on us. So we have this whole different way of life that they had completely obliterated. They killed all of the buffalo. They, all of the beaver, those dams, they ruined the entire ecosystem with their ways when they came here and implanted cows, all sorts of things that didn't make any sense to our people. Well, now it makes sense, of course. They were taking ownership of the land. So the Indian agent forced us into these tiny little reserves. And the RCMP would keep us surrounded, and we would have to show a pass if we were going to leave. So if I had a relative that passed away, I may not even be allowed to go to the funeral.
Oh, that's sad.
So the Indian agent was replaced with a so-called chief. But this is not a real form of democracy, and it was nothing close to what our ways of governance is. So you'll hear Canadian Indian Act chiefs in council, and then you'll hear hereditary chiefs. And that's back to our traditional ways. So we recognize our chiefs in that.
It's like
respect.
we need to do another whole episode on that one.
A whole episode
that's
on that.
Lots to learn.
Yep,
lots.
Well, it is and it isn't. As soon as you understand that the British imposed all of these laws, then it makes a lot of sense why there's so much problems right now. And like even for me, I ran for politics to try to bridge that gap. But unfortunately, people were not ready to hear these conversations yet.
I think personally that because probably people don't know the history of it.
Oh.
They don't know the origin.
Absolutely.
Without people understanding the original story behind it, the history behind it, I think rest everything becomes a secondary thing, and it loses the meaning for what you wanted to do, and the outcome was a little different, I would say.
Well, and it's a reflection too of colonization globally.
Absolutely.
I mean, no matter where Britain has touched, whether it was China, whether it was India, whether it was Canada, now we have complete problems as a result of that colonization.
Absolutely.
And you know, and they stole all of our artifacts, and they have them in their museums that now I would have to pay $100 to go see.
True, yeah.
So there's a lot of, I mean, it's ironic and funny to us now.
Absolutely, yeah.
But the truth is that damage is still done. And
Yes.
until Canadians see themselves reflected as part of the British laws that continue to allow this to happen, you know, one of the arguments I hear from people is, well, I shouldn't have to pay for my grandfather's sins.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem is that was set up with their grandfathers,
Yep.
and that they still benefit today.
Mm-hmm.
So today our children are being apprehended, and we're being put into the jails and such because they don't want to recognize us and our ways. It's
Mm-hmm.
just easier to eliminate us.
Yeah.
So that's why we have the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women. And our children are being apprehended through the foster system, and then we are being put into jails for speaking out.
That's a lot. I'm sorry to hear about that.
Yeah.
That's yes, and that's the main motive, or a little bit of our studio, Punjab Knox Studios initiative. We're trying to bridge that gap
Yes.
with knowledge.
Yes.
With the proper knowledge, I would say, and the terminology, so that people can learn,
Mm-hmm.
and they can. The next generations coming up
Mm-hmm.
probably will be much, much, much better than the previous one, or even the ones you and me are on in.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So probably our viewers are enjoying our series. And Michelle, coming back to the question, I feel like we need to know more about that. I asked you a question before that when in the previous thousand or in the older days,
Mm-hmm.
How Indigenous people were surviving. What were they doing? And how were they doing? I think probably there was no railways, no proper roads,
Mm-hmm.
no transportation. How and what sources were there? I'm just curious.
Oh, it's so ironic to me, because if you look at Turtle Island, you will see
Turtle Island means whole North America, Canada and America, right?
That's right.
Nice.
And it's a complete river system. So what we have now is highways, but our highways have always been the rivers.
Oh.
So we had all sorts of trading posts, like Mokinstis, Elbow, where the elbow meets the bow. It was a trading area because it was on the rivers. So when you see highways, we see ridiculousness, but our rivers were the highways.
Oh.
Yeah. So we would do our trading via highways.
And it was
the
ships
rivers.
and boats and...
Well, look, more canoes than anything. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, more canoes.
Were
than
the
anything.
canoes like the modern day canoes, or they were
Yeah.
different?
Yeah, well, the modern day canoes are based off of our canoes.
Nice.
Even the shape, right?
Even the shape, eh?
Yeah, yeah. And a lot of the, history of learning how to navigate canoes is because of us.
Cool.
So that bigger picture of understanding, instead of looking at North America with highways, look at the river system and recognize that's how we did our trading.
Oh, so you guys could go from Calgary to all the way to Texas.
Yes, absolutely.
And even beyond, if it was all
If
one
we wanted
island.
to, absolutely. But we had kind of our territories that we took care of.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, if you look at our treaties and our boundaries as nations, they're almost always along river systems, almost
Right.
always along the mountain systems.
Mm-hmm.
And it's done on purpose, right? Is to establish these are our boundaries. But these are also our trading routes. So what is now Banff used to be a trading route between, the Kootenays and the Blackfoot.
Mm-hmm.
And the Cree as well. So we
Oh.
had all of these different people doing tradings at these different junctures of where elbow and the bow meet,
Mm-hmm.
these types of places. Yeah.
So just a question, again, curiosity.
Mm-hmm.
So around Calgary,
Mm-hmm.
you mentioned Banff and the surrounding area. So what kind of trade was here?
Yeah, so we would trade a lot of our buffalo, I should clarify, the Blackfoot would trade a lot of their buffalo along with the Kootenays, who had a lot of fish and shells,
Mhm.
and they would trade.
Oh,
Yeah, so it was a lot of trade commerce. Yeah.
It's one buffalo for a few fishes and...
Absolutely. Yeah.
Oh,
and
cool.
and berries that would be over here, maybe over here. So we were talking earlier about sage. Well, sage is pretty native to just this area. So, you know, folks way out in other areas may want some of our sage. So we would trade. And that was our medicines too. Like even bear grease is considered a medicine to us. So we may trade some of our sage for bear grease or whatever that looked like. So.
Oh, that's interesting. I can relate that to ancient India, I would say. Back in the day before the Britishers, or even during the Britishers, I would say that that's how Indians would do that.
Yep.
Indians from India.
Yes. Out in India.
In India, in Asia.
You know, maybe that's a great moment to bring up the fact that the reason why we were called Indians by the British was that they had already met your people and thought, oh, these guys look like Indians, so we'll call them Indians.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, well, it's pretty funny to us now. We have, you know, somebody from India talking to what Canada calls an Indian, but...
Indian.
Again,
nice.
Our humor.
There you go. We're Albertans as well.
Yeah.
Positive energy is transferring.
That's
I like
right.
that.
Yeah.
So viewers, we did learn much more about in this episode of Punjab Knox Studio with Michelle Robinson, our wonderful speaker here today. And we'll continue lots more in the next coming episodes. Well, thank you so much, Michelle, for coming over and telling us wonderful things and keeping up the humor as well.
Yes, I'm honored to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you.